Hi, I'm Jane from ReWild. We're a bat rehabilitation and conservation organization in Palabora, South Africa. We are right on the border of the Kruger National Park. And I wanted to do this video to explain why we are so concerned about what Kruger has been and is doing and will do to their bats. The park boasts 80% of South Africa's bat population. That's a very large number of our bats, and that needs to be managed correctly. Now, firstly, this is a real problem. Kruger has a real problem. The bats are in the accommodation in the park, and the guests are getting there. There's bat poop on the kitchen counter, there's bat poop in the beds, and the guests are asking for either to be moved to accommodation without bats or to have their money refunded, which is completely understandable, absolutely understandable. But what one has to realize is this is actually not a new problem. This problem is over a decade old. Kruger has had bats in the accommodation for a very long time, and they haven't managed this problem correctly, and that's why we're now in the position we're in. The Kruger National Park then put out a social media statement to say that they're taking down all the bat houses in the park. The reason they give for that is that the bat houses are getting full, and those bats are then moving into the surrounding buildings. Now, that's nonsense. They put up the bat houses because they had bats in the buildings. Anyone that knows anything about bats and getting them out of roofs knows that if you have bats in a roof and you put up a bat house, you're going to wind up with bats in the roof and maybe a few in the bat house. But they're not going to move from the roofs to the bat house on their own. You have to do a proper bat exclusion from the building, and the bats will then take up occupancy in the bat house. They're not going to leave the building on their own. So that's complete nonsense. They then go on to say that it's a complicated matter to keep bats out of buildings as they originate from the natural bush. However, once they've taken down all the bat houses, they will then figure out how to get them out the buildings. Now, just as far as taking down the bat houses go, in Lower Sabi Camp, which is where they say they have already started this, there are around 40 bat houses. Each bat house is going to have between 200, 500 bats. They are full, apparently. That's 8,000 to 20,000 bats that they are going to suddenly make homeless by removing the bat houses. So we went back to them on this. We contacted Kruger about it and said, look, don't do that. If you take those bat houses and remove them, you're going to have 8,000 to 20,000 bats looking for new accommodation, and they're going to go into your buildings and make your situation worse. It's insane. They came back and said, no, 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 we're not actually removing the bat houses. What we're doing is we're putting netting over the bat house and trapping the bats in there, taking a forklift and lifting the whole lot up and driving it off into the bush and putting it up in the bush. In fact, we've done 4 already. It was a great success. And we argued you shouldn't be doing this during the breeding season. They're pups that are non-flighted. They said, no, don't worry, because one of the bat houses opened up when we were moving it. In other words, it fell apart, and we didn't see any babies there. A non-flighted juvenile bat looks very, very similar to an adult bat, so I'm not sure they would have told the difference, but anyway. But that's hugely concerning, and it's one of the things we raised with them, is you can't move the bat houses like that. Many of the bat houses in the Kruger Park are not new, and bat houses are not that strong. They just house little bats. And as you're moving them with forklifts and carrying on, those bat houses are going to start to come apart. And bat wings and bat feet and the whole bats are going to get squashed in it. Never mind the fact that it's got to be seriously traumatic for the bats. They suddenly get locked in their house ups and buggers off into the bush. I'm sure a rather bumpy ride before setting up in a completely new neighborhood. And then the doors are unlocked again and they can get out. I'm sure they're going to be a little bit concerned that their house might do that again, and are likely to go back to the camp, find no accommodation, and move in with the rest of the bats in the buildings. To then go on and say it's a complicated matter to keep bats out of buildings, that's nonsense. Bats in buildings has been an issue around the world for forever and a day. There are methods to get them out and keep them out, and that's called a bat exclusion. Now, Kruger, in some of the other documents, talk about, yeah, but they've got thatched roofs and tin roofs, and that's so difficult to keep the bats out of. It's nearly impossible. And requires continuous maintenance and stuff. It doesn't. We do bat exclusions. We've done bat exclusions in buildings with thatch roofs and put up bat houses as is recommended around the world. You put up a bat house when you do a bat exclusion, get the bats out the thatch roof, they're living in the bat houses, and we seal the thatch roofs. It doesn't take continuous maintenance. We've had buildings that we did 5 years ago. We've never gone back to do any maintenance or anything like that. The bats are still not in the buildings. The bats are in the bat houses. In our communication with Kruger, we also asked them who the experts were that had advised them to do this. Because it's that crazy that, we would like to know what they were thinking, actually. And Kruger came back, they sent us 4 names. And we contacted a couple of them, and they know nothing about this, what Kruger's doing. So we went back to Kruger and we said, look, come on, can you please just give us the names of the experts that advised you? Because they claim to have bat experts that advised them. Can you please just give us the names of them so we can have a chat to them? They then came back and said, no, they'd given that to a journalist in the Sunday Times who had recently done an article on the bat houses being moved in Kruger. So we knew who the journalist was. We contacted her and said, well, did Kruger give you the names of the bat experts they consulted and who are advising on this project? And she said, no, they hadn't. And it's very concerning. If there were bat experts that had advised Kruger to do this, it shouldn't be a problem. Kruger should just give us the names of those people so we can chat to them and see, what were you thinking? What's your logic here? But there don't seem to be any experts because for some reason they top secret who these experts, bat experts are. And nobody we've spoken to had anything to do with advising Kruger. And trust me, we know a few people in the bat circles. And yeah, so where are the experts? Because hopefully Kruger has consulted some bat experts on this. You would think so. But for some reason, they're not happy to hand out their names, which is very, very concerning. After we put out a statement in response to Kruger removing their bat houses, we were contacted by someone and asked if we had seen these photographs, which we hadn't. They were taken at the Lois RB camp in Kruger National Park at the end of March, and that's the breeding season of the bats, so this is a time when there would be baby bats unable to fly. The lady who took these photographs, she took about 12 photos of dead bats and birds just in her accommodation. She also walked in both directions from her accommodation unit, and she said every roof she saw was exactly the same, full of dead bats and dead birds. The dead birds actually let us know that this was done at night, which means it was done for the bats. If you look here, you can see there's a mommy sparrow, daddy sparrow, and baby sparrow. That's a whole family of sparrows that they're trapped in there. Now, you can only do that if you put the wire up at night, otherwise the birds would have flown away. And this is not an uncommon mistake that people make, in that they think that all the bats will fly away at night, so they wait till it's nighttime, then they seal up the building, hoping that the bats won't be able to get in. What they don't realize is that not all bats fly at the same time. And that's why it's important to do proper bat exclusions and not just do things like this, because this is the result. Making this kind of mistake is, understandable, although if you're the Kruger National Park, you should know better. What we have had is members of the public saying they've been seeing this as long as 3 years ago happening in the park. If you make a mistake, it's one thing, but you don't keep making it for years and years and years. This appears to be acceptable to Kruger. In fact, the lady who took these photographs spoke to park staff at the time, and they just sort of looked at her blankly, is what she said, like she might be the crazy one. Staff had to have been walking past the buildings and seen this, and nobody did anything. It wasn't just one building, it was numerous buildings. The woman walked in both directions. Every building was the same, full of dead bats and full of dead birds, and nobody did anything. The bats would have lasted 3 to 5 days, the birds probably a day or two, and nobody did a thing. They just left them there to die. At the time, somebody actually emailed Kruger over these photographs, and their response was, "We have a bat problem. The mesh is there to stop the bats from penetrating the buildings." That kind of response makes you think that they seem to think this is an acceptable way to deal with their bat problem. We also emailed these photographs to senior management in the Kruger National Park. and they didn't even bother to reply about them, which is, it's seriously concerning. Nobody, whether it was the staff at the camp, whether it was emails from a member of the public, emails from us, nowhere did Kruger come back and say, hell, we don't know how this happened. We will look into it and ensure that it never happens again. It is as though they believe this is how you deal with your bat problems. And this is completely unacceptable. This is not how you deal with a bat problem. And that goes with all bat conservation organizations will tell you this is wrong, as well as any animal welfare organizations. This is grossly unacceptable. As I've said, the problem in Kruger is that they don't do proper bat exclusions. Now, how do we know this? Well, this document here is the Bat Management Guidelines. You can find it on the South African National Parks' website, sandparks.org, and Kruger National Park falls under SANParks. Now, these bat management guidelines, you can see here, it's evict bats from units already colonized. And it clearly says here, to get the bats out, you should administer HTH chlorine. Now, that's not how you do a bat exclusion. You don't use chemicals and toxins in a bat exclusion. Now, we first came across this document in around about 2012, and back then it used to recommend using Jay's fluid instead of chlorine. The document's pretty much the same except for the Jay's fluid in the past, and it now says chlorine, which seems to be a very recent change. Another interesting point in this document is they recommend doing these bat exclusions between May to October, which is a bit concerning because the free-tailed bats are still breeding in May. That's the bat they have a problem with. They still have non-flighted pups in May. And in October, the yellow-bellied house bats very often pup, as well as some of the other species. But we do know, I've personally seen yellow-bellied house bats roosting in the accommodation in Kruger. So they're doing their exclusions in months that do still have pups that are not flighted, which is very concerning, and they should know better. The problem with using toxic chemicals to get the bats out of the roofs is that it's damaging to them. And one wants to get them out without harming them, and there are ways to do that. That's called a proper bat exclusion. Now, Jay's fluid, if you read on it, it says use in a well-ventilated area for a very good reason. If you inhale the fumes of Jay's fluid, it's very damaging to the airways, and they actually say that it's more damaging for a child because the airways are more narrow. Now, the airways of a bat are a hell of a lot more narrow than those of a human. And then chlorine is very damaging. Chlorine, inhalation of chlorine, you just have to sniff some and you'll know all about it. It's going to burn your airways. It can cause ulceration in the eyes. It can also have longer term effects where you can be fine initially after inhaling chlorine, but later on, and significantly later on, you can end up with things like pulmonary edema and respiratory failure leading to death. So it may not even be an immediate reaction. It may kill you later on. So this is very, very toxic stuff. Now in here, they're very careful to stipulate, do not apply the deterrent, which is the chlorine, directly to the roost site. That's to the place where the bats are roosting. Now, I've had some people say, yeah, but we don't spray it on the bats. The next bit tells you that the colony should be sufficiently disturbed and leave. If spraying the chlorine is disturbing the bats, then it's having an impact on them. Now, bats will drink swimming pool water quite happily, so they're not averse to low levels of chlorine. They're averse to being harmed by chlorine. That's why they're leaving. They're being harmed. And they continue to say that if not all the bats leave after the first application of chlorine, spray some more chlorine in until they leave. Now, they're only going to leave if they're being harmed. This is harmful to the bats. No two ways about it. And in fact, in South Africa, you are not allowed to use poisonous toxic substances on the bats to get them out of your roof. It's actually illegal. There is no poison registered in South Africa for the use on bats. So what they're doing here is just not on. And we broached the subject with Kruger, and they flatly denied it. They said they don't use Jay's fluid or chlorine to get the bats out of their roofs. It's sitting in their own bat management guidelines. And they've actually said we're untruthful in saying this. So despite pointing out to Kruger that the use of Jay's fluid and chlorine on the bats is in their bat management guidelines, they still deny the use of it and claim that it's banned, etc., in the park. Recently, recently on Facebook, I was chatting to somebody and advising them on how to get bats out of their roof when this other person joined the conversation saying, we lived in Skakuza. Skakuza is one of the camps in the Kruger National Park. You live there if you're staff or staff family. And and they said that you can get them out with chlorine. So I went back to them and said, well, the use of chlorine and other toxic substances on bats is illegal in South Africa. They then came back and said they were told to do that when they lived there. Now, that tells you something. I've also personally chatted to a number of the camp managers over the years about the use of, back then it was Jay's fluid, and tried to talk them into doing proper humane bat exclusions. And I mean, all of them confirmed that they use Jay's fluid. So it's both from personal experience, and you can see here, as well as in their bat management guidelines, this is what they have been doing and what they think is correct. Those bat management guidelines are still on their website. The methods that Kruger National Park have been using to get the bats out of their accommodation are not necessary. It's not necessary to harm bats. It's not necessary to kill bats. Proper humane bat exclusions can be done, and they are very effective. And we have offered Kruger, because Kruger have their own maintenance teams, we have offered Kruger to come in, train their maintenance staff, and help with this problem that they have with the bats in the roofs and get the bats out humanely. Now, we've offered to do this, we've made the offer twice, and we've offered to do it absolutely free of charge. No charge to Kruger. We come in on our, we'll pay for our fuel, we'll pay for our staff, everything, and we will come and do it free of charge for them. And both times they've turned us down. About 2 years ago, I also went in by invitation to Mapani camp in the Kruger National Park and did a training session there on how to do humane bat exclusions for both the local honorary rangers and the management at Mapani camp. And they were very enthusiastic. And at the time it was breeding season, and I said to them, when you're ready to do this, when the bats are finished breeding, then we will come in, we're happy to assist, etc. And they, like I say, they were very enthusiastic. It was well received. And a while later, I got feedback that the Kruger National Park has decided they want a cheaper and easier way of sorting out their bat problem, and that they will be having a think tank at Skakuza Camp in the Kruger National Park in order to find a better way of doing it. And as we can see the results. Now, here's the problem with Kruger wanting a cheaper and easier way to get bats out of the roof. To get bats out of a roof doing a proper humane bat exclusion, it's not rocket science. You go and you have a look where the bats are coming in and out the buildings, and you then seal everywhere else that the bats could get in and out but aren't currently. You then put in devices called exclusion devices that are basically a one-way door over the areas where they're coming in and out. The bats then fly out in the evening as they would normally and go out hunting. When they come back, those one-way doors stop them from getting back in. So there's no poisons used. It's also something that must definitely be done outside of the breeding season because obviously the baby bats can't fly. So you want to do it when all the bats are old enough to be flying. And it's that simple. No poisons need to be used. No bats need to be hurt. No bats need to be killed. You leave those one-way doors in for a while and ensure all the bats are out. Once all the bats are out, that's normally, it's at least 4 days, sometimes longer depending on weather conditions. Once that's out, all the bats are out, you remove the one-way devices and seal the building completely. So your real cost there is your labor. Kruger already have maintenance teams. It's any travel costs to get to site, which Kruger don't have, and it's your materials to seal the building. And no matter what Kruger does, the only way they're going to keep the bats out is to seal the building. So the cost is no different no matter what they do. The only difference is whether the bats get harmed in the process and killed in the process or not. Kruger choosing not to do proper humane bat exclusions indicates either they don't understand how to do a proper humane bat exclusion, they're not being advised by bat experts, because any bat expert knows about how to do a humane bat exclusion, how to do a proper one. There, it makes no sense. And this is why we're so terribly distressed about it. The bats Kruger's having a problem with are free-tailed bats. Now, to understand these bats, they would naturally roost in crevices, in rock faces, caves, hollows of trees, that sort of thing. But these bats have adapted to living in urban environments, roosting in roofs and bat houses and expansion joints of bridges. And that's where they roost in Kruger. Same thing. Now, they come in large colonies, couple of hundred to thousands of bats in South Africa. In the States, they have even bigger colonies, 15 to 20 million bats. Now, the just to give you an idea how these colonies get so large, free-tailed bats are what are known as open-air flyers. So they've been found flying as high as 3 kilometers up at 160 k's an hour, and that's not conducive to finding roosts. It's very high up. It's not easy. They're not the guys that flit around your garden. They fly high up. Now, as an example, University of Florida put up a really large bat house, could accommodate 250,000 bats. Initially, they had a couple of male bats in it, and then 1,000 female bats moved in the January. 5 months later, in May, there were 8,000 bats in there. Now, it's not that those females reproduced. What happened was they called all their friends and said, hey, come, we got a bat house. And that's how those numbers grow. So the large number of bats in the Kruger Park camps is not indicative of what is out in the bush. Those bats are being called into those camps. The camps have lights attracting insects. Most of them are on rivers or have swimming pools, so there's water for the bats, and they got good accommodation. That's why the bats are there. Now, these bats are listed as least concern on the IUCN Red Data list. And one of the main reasons for that is because they're found in our protected areas, such as the Kruger National Park. So it's imperative that the Kruger National Park actually protect these bats. And we have no idea whether their numbers are going up, their numbers are going down, how many individuals we actually have. We have very little data on bats. Bats are hard to monitor in that way. They live in little crevices, they're very small, so there's no real data on them. Now, the other thing with them is they're very slow to reproduce. Free-tailed bats have between 1 and 3 pups a year, typically in South Africa. And that means if they're persecuted in large numbers, it takes a hell of a long time to grow that colony back up to a decent size or to replace the numbers lost. And with these bats roosting in roofs, it's a very, very big problem is the persecution by people for these bats, for roof roosting. It's a very, very big problem. And the question is, if there are 50,000 bats in a camp in Kruger, if that number dropped to 30,000 bats, would anybody notice? I don't think so. I really don't think so. We've seen a sharp decrease in the number of bats coming into rehab over the last couple of years, like 75% less, which indicates that the wild population actually isn't doing all that well. Now, that makes it even more important that the Kruger National Park does the right thing here. We're talking a very large number of bats. As I said, Lower Sabi Camp, 40 bat houses, that could be 20,000 bats. They then also have shops and restaurants in the camp. They have around 100 units of accommodation for guests, plus they have staff accommodation. They have the same problem in the staff accommodation of bats going into the roofs. It's a very, very large number of bats. They have about 12 main camps through Kruger Park, as well as a number of bush camps and bush lodges. We could be talking 500,000 plus bats that are going to be impacted by what Kruger does here. And that makes it imperative that they do things properly and do things the right way. That they don't actually have a negative impact on the free-tailed bat population. The numbers are that big. Now, our recommendation to Kruger has been, firstly, don't disturb the bats when they're having babies. And we also recommend that they don't do any bat exclusions or anything else to the bats during the colder periods. The bats use torpor to conserve energy. They're in an energy conservation time during the middle of winter when it's very cold, and that's not an ideal time to disturb the bats. And they need to put up bat houses before doing exclusions from the buildings. sufficient accommodation for the bats. Those bats that are roosting in the guest accommodation in the camps, this has been a problem, as I said, for over a decade. Those bats for generations have been living in bat houses and roofs of buildings. And bats are highly intelligent, and they learn. They learn a lot of stuff from the other bats. Now, there was actually, I was reading a story about a guy who does bat exclusions, and he was chasing a little family of bats from one roof attic to another, doing exclusion, and they just kept moving from one attic to the next attic, and he was just chasing them around the neighborhood. He was putting up bat houses, but they weren't using the bat houses, they were looking for attics. Until he changed the exterior of the bat house to look like the shutters on the attics. As soon as he did that, the bats took up occupation in the bat house. Why? Because they were looking for what they knew as their roost. And I suspect you're going to have the same thing in Kruger. Those bats are going to be looking for roofs and bat houses, not caves and hollows and dead trees. Free-tail bats also, they can leave the roost at dusk and return at dawn. That's going to leave them very little time, if they get back at just before dawn, just before sunup, to discover that they've been locked out of their roost. Those bats are then going to be a large number of them urgently looking for accommodation. And what's going to happen if they can't find suitable roosting sites? They're going to end up roosting in inappropriate places that is going to leave them open to predation, or they're going to fly themselves to exhaustion trying to find somewhere to roost. And that has happened. I know of bat exclusion, a very large bat exclusion of free-tailed bats, where no bat houses were put up, and the bats were literally being picked up off the street. They had flown themselves to exhaustion and grounded. So that's why we're recommending the bat houses. It is a human solution to the problem, but this is a human problem. We have made this problem for over a decade. If it might have been different if it had been handled correctly in the beginning, but it wasn't, and that is where it is at now. To do proper bat exclusions, the Kruger National Park for over a decade has done their own thing in dealing with the bats in the camps that are roosting in the accommodation. They've done their own thing, and it hasn't worked in over a decade. Now, it's bats in roofs is not an exclusive Kruger National Park problem. It's a problem around the world, and there are ways to get bats out, and we're just recommending that they try them. Um, on that basis, if they do proper bat exclusions, they have no need to take down the existing bat houses in the camps, because the bats, if you do a proper bat exclusion, the bats can't get back into the buildings, and there's absolutely no need to take down the bat houses. The bat houses never caused the problem of the bats in the roofs in the first place. They were put up because the bats were in the roofs. And the last thing we would like to suggest is that they have a protocol in place to assist bats should any bats get into trouble due to their activity of getting them out of the roofs, as opposed to what they have done in the past. As we've seen, they just leave them to starve. If they get trapped somewhere, just leave them there. And that's actually not acceptable. You know, Kruger Park management are the custodians of our park. The Kruger National Park belongs to the people of South Africa, and the management there are the custodians. It's not their animals, it's not their park. They have a duty to look after the wildlife there, including the bats. And that's really all we're asking them to do, is to do things properly. This is a man-made problem. They've made it, and they need to handle it with great care, and not to do things that could negatively impact the free-tailed bat population in the park, and to handle it in a way that it's humane and takes into account the welfare of the individual bats that are being impacted. And that's really what we're asking. And we don't think that's a lot to ask. If you're visiting the Kruger National Park, please keep your eyes open. If you see anything going on with the bats, the bat houses, etc., please take photos, please take video, please send it through to us. And then if something not right is happening, we can do something and intervene. Thank you very much.